Okay, the next bone is the occipital bone. This bone makes up the majority of the back of the skull, but also the base of the skull here. So it goes clear from the back here, clear forward to include even that part right there. So most of that right through there is all occipital bone. Okay. Before, when we looked at this, we saw where the occipital bone meets with the two parietal bones here at this lambdoidal suture. Hope you can see that okay. But then a few other landmarks to be aware of. Some are really big and obvious, like for example the foramen magnum, this large opening through which passes the brainstem and spinal cord. And then flanking it on either sides are these knob-like protrusions called the occipital condyles. These are the points where it articulates, the occipital bone articulates with the atlas or C1 of the cervical vertebrae. Running underneath those, and this skull doesn't show those very well. Let me see if I can see it on this one here, maybe a little bit better. So here you can see foramen magnum and then the two occipital condyles. You can see just inside right there, this little canal. That's the hypoglossal canal. That will transmit the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve. So you've got one there, one will be on this side as well. So that's the hypoglossal canal. And then finally, on the back of the skull here, and this one shows a really distinct one of these. So here's the occipital bone again. You can see this external occipital protuberance, this fairly prominent bump, and most people can feel that on themselves. And then going away from it, these kind of ridges right here and here, these are the superior nuchal lines, those two. Okay, so that's the occipital bone. Then as we move to the next bone, that will be the palatine bone. Let me see if I can get a point where you can see this very well. Lay it on the side that way. The palatine bone is the small plate-like bone that makes up the posterior 1/3 of the hard palate. So if this entire region is the hard palate, the anterior part here is made up of these flat bony plates known as the palatine processes of the maxillary bone. But the posterior part right here, these bones are the palatine bones. And they just kind of make this back flat region of the hard palate. And on the posterior corners of those, you can see these openings here, and those are the palatine foramen. The vomer is the next bone to identify, and that's this plow-shaped bone right here. It's sort of a wedge right there. It's fairly small, and when you view it from the back, it just looks like a sort of shark fin or dorsal fin of some sort. But it's actually more of a spike-like plow-shaped bone that actually ends up protruding all the way forward and eventually coming out right here. So it runs forward, clear from back there to here. It starts broad in the back and narrows down to where it just comes back right behind this anterior nasal spine. So that's also vomer. Occasionally, when students look into the anterior part of the skull like this, on atlases, they'll see a label line kind of coming in like this and pointing to it and saying that that's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. And that's because it is. This upper part right here is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, but the lower part is actually the vomer. The two connect together to form the bony portion of the nasal septum. So the upper part of the nasal septum is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. The bottom part of the bony septum is the vomer. All right, next is the sphenoid bone. Now this one's kind of complex because it sits right in the center of the skull and is composed of a lot of interesting sort of shapes and portions. I wish I had a colored skull to show this to you because it would outline the bone quite nicely, but you can find that probably on your own in the labs. But essentially imagine a kind of moth-shaped or butterfly-shaped bone where this is the center part of the moth or the body, and then you'd have these kind of wing-like protrusions coming out here and back here to form a kind of butterfly shape, like this, okay? And because it does have that kind of butterfly shape, oftentimes when we describe the sphenoid bone, it's described as having a body and then wings, with the front wings being sort of smaller or lesser wings, and then these larger protruding wings coming back here, the greater wings. Again, on a colored skull, that will make a lot more sense to you. The sphenoid bone itself also houses the majority of the foramen that are found with the cranial fossa. And so by foramen, I mean these openings through which vessels and nerves pass. So most of those are associated with the sphenoid bone. And so I'll take just a moment and go through some of those. So I've already identified the body portion of the sphenoid, so it's just this central core. And then I've also identified these lesser wings up here, which are found in the posterior portion of the anterior cranial fossa, so these little areas. And then the greater wing is going to be back here. And I want to just go through some of these foramen going from the front to the back. So the very first of these foramen is this one here, which is the optic foramen. This is what will transmit cranial nerve number 1. Oh, my hand's right in the way, sorry. Optic foramen there. Okay, then as we move back from there, you can kind of see up underneath the lesser wing right here, you see this sort of teardrop-shaped opening right there. And that is the superior orbital fissure. That's going to transmit several cranial nerves. And then as we go back from there, there's this rounded one right there. That's foramen rotundum. And then as we come back here, we see a sort of oval-shaped one. That's foramen ovale. And then we have foramen spinosum. And then just immediately medial to that, you can kind of see this. Sorry, it's darker in there now. A foramen that goes straight down through there, and that's the foramen lacerum. Okay, now don't confuse that one with this foramen that's going sideways here. This is one we saw earlier, and that's the carotid canal associated with the petrous portion of the temporal bone. This is the foramen lacerum, and it goes straight down. They share an upper opening, but they go in different directions. So this one going obliquely through the bone is the carotid canal. The one going straight down is foramen lacerum. All of these will transmit either vessels or nerves, or both in some cases, except for the lacerum. It's actually not a real opening. The lacerum is actually plugged with a chunk of cartilage in real life, but in a skull like this, where the cartilage has disintegrated, it leaves behind a hole. So nothing actually passes through foramen lacerum. It's an artifact that occurs as a result of the disintegration of the cartilage that's normally found in that. So it's not a true foramen in that sense. Okay, so again, just to quickly run through some of those, here's optic foramen. Then we have superior orbital fissure, that one right there. Then foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, foramen lacerum. Okay, and those of course will be paired so you see the same on both sides. The body portion here is broken into a number of parts. The whole area here is referred to as the sella turcica, or the Turk's saddle. And it's got a number of different components to it, just like a saddle. So this front little bump right here is called the tuberculum sellae, which is this sort of tubercle of the saddle. So think of this as being like the saddle horn. And then you have an indentation, and this is going to be where the pituitary gland will sit as it hangs off the front part of the brain. And so that indentation right there is called the hypophyseal fossa. The hypophysis is another name for the pituitary. So hypophyseal fossa, so the fossa is an indentation. And then the back part here, these ridges, this is referred to, or this ridge along here, this is called the dorsum sellae, or the dorsal part of the saddle. And it has on its two back edges here, these two kind of spikes, and those are called the posterior clinoid processes. Now, you've probably learned enough of anatomy to know that if something is referred to as a posterior structure, oftentimes there's an anterior structure, and that is the case here. So here are the posterior clinoids, these two bumps, and the anterior clinoids are actually these two. Okay, those are anterior clinoid processes, posterior clinoid processes here and here. So you can kind of get a sense of what those look like. All right. Now, one last view of the sphenoid bone. So we spend most of our time probably looking at the sphenoid from the interior, but as you can imagine, you could probably see most of the sphenoid bone from the bottom side as well, and that's definitely the case. So we'll flip it over to this side and sort of imagine that that sphenoid bone is going to be found like right in through here. Okay, that's going to be where the sphenoid bone will be found. And it will include these ridges right through here. These are called the pterygoid plates, and they're part of the sphenoid. So those are found at the very back of the nasal cavity. And there's a medial plate and a lateral plate, so on each side. So medial and lateral pterygoid plates.